Now, they're not policy in Michigan right now, but the political climate has changed. So this is a model that we use to show how think tanks shape what we call a window of political possibility. Okay, and now let's switch back to PowerPoint. So then in the world of politics, from an elected official's perspective, this is how ideas go from outside the window to well within the window. First, these new policies are unthinkable. Well, we couldn't possibly let parents choose their own schools. I mean, they might choose the wrong school for their child. It's unthinkable. And then it moves to merely radical. Well, you know, maybe some parents would be capable of it, but it's a pretty radical choice. I mean, why would you want to choose your own school? I mean, that's why we draw school districts around neighborhoods. Then it becomes acceptable, then sensible, popular, and finally policy. Now, these do usually happen in order, but it's not necessarily a smooth progression. When there is political opportunity, things can change very fast. It often happens in a crisis. Now, we're seeing this in economic policy in this country right now, aren't we? I mean, 1 year ago, who could have imagined partial nationalization of banks, possibly nationalization of automobile companies, and on and on. I don't have to tell you what all has been going on. That happened in one short year, and it was in response to a crisis. But these ideas didn't come out of nowhere. Think tanks help prepare the way so that policymakers can act when the crises come or when the political opportunities come. Why don't you go to the next slide, Joe? I like the way that Milton Friedman said this. Milton Friedman, who died just last year, or about a year and a half ago. In 1962, he said, "Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. And when that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken," he meant by elected leaders, "the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around." That, I believe, is our basic function. He meant the think tanks. That's the think tank's basic function. To develop alternatives to existing policies and to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable. And so, think tanks aren't the folks who are actually getting laws passed, but they can have a tremendous influence on the environment that passes laws. A writer named John Miller wrote a story on think tanks for Philanthropy magazine. And I want to show you how he summed up, go ahead, Joe, how he summed up what think tanks do. He said, "Think tanks are perhaps best at creating conditions for success as opposed to being directly responsible for the success itself. The manager of a baseball team can make his team's victory or defeat more or less likely based on the choices he makes before anybody even swings a bat. But likewise, it is always nearly impossible to draw a straight line from the product of a think tank to any particular public policy." And so that's what makes explaining what think tanks do kind of difficult. You can't draw that straight line. A lot of people who look at the political world, the policy world, if they want to know how public policy comes into being, but all they look at is the legislature, it's like watching a football game through a hole in the fence that only lets you see the 10 yards in front of the goal line. Because, yeah, that is precisely where the scoring happens. But you miss the plays further up the field that set up the big play. And this is the role of idea generators in our society. Think tanks, media, academics, and so on and so forth. And these are critical to moving these ideas along. The policies being put in place today in Washington are not being grabbed out of thin air and devised by the elected officials there. They were developed a long time ago by the defunct economists that John Maynard Keynes talked about and have been lying around for the right opportunity. Now, I told you about this fighter pilot who wanted to get involved. And the economist said, don't just run for office, get involved in ideas. Well, his name was Anthony Fisher, and he went on to make a fortune in the chicken business. He was a chicken farmer. He helped found two very remarkable think tanks. One was the Institute of Economic Affairs in Britain, and one was the Atlas Foundation for Economic Research here in the United States. He's considered one of the godfathers in the free market think tank movement. The Institute of Economic Affairs was sort of the intellectual root of a lot of Margaret Thatcher's policy ideas. And the Atlas Foundation in our country has helped support think tanks including ours and Show Me Institute, the Heritage Foundation, Cato Institute, others that you may have heard of in this country. And so I always love giving this talk to folks like you, because we often find, as we're looking for people to support this kind of work, we run into lots of people who understand the importance of supporting the right political candidates. It's critically important, because not everybody who's at first and goal scores, right? Political leadership is important. But we also find that people become frustrated. People who support political candidates become frustrated. They said, I put this money into politics, and what did I get for it? I got a guy who told me he couldn't vote his conscience. Too often that's what they hear. We try to help people understand that they, like Anthony Fisher, they also need to be active in the world of ideas, to stretch that window of political possibility, to give the elected officials some running room and the intellectual ammunition they need to get good policy passed. And I think the better we all understand how think tanks work, the better we'll be able to carry worthwhile ideas to fruition through that political process. Most of the kind of policy changes we're interested in can't be accomplished in one legislative session or one political cycle. We're in this for the long haul. The ideas of liberty and free market and limited governments are ideas that the whole country was founded on. These are ideas that don't translate themselves immediately to public policy. They need someone to explain, well, what's a free market transportation system look like? If we had a limited government, who would feed poor people? These aren't immediately obvious to everyone, and it's our job to explain that. That's what the Show Me Institute is here for, and it's a critical role in better public policy in Missouri, to help create durable policy changes grounded in social change. So that's how think tanks change public policy, and I would be happy to take any questions that you have. One question I get sometimes is, well, should I stop supporting politicians? I said, well, I would stop supporting a politician who lied to you, but in general, no. No. We need people to be engaged both politically and in the world of ideas.
I have a question.
Yes?
It appears to me Great Britain has gotten a long way from Margaret Thatcher. What happened over there and become so liberal compared to Britain under her?
Yeah, the question is, things seem to have gotten away from some of the things Margaret Thatcher accomplished in Britain. And I'm not an expert on British policy by any means, but I think just looking at what we've talked about tonight, one way to explain it would be that they accomplished some policy changes without necessarily having the underlying social change to make those policy changes durable. They've got a parliamentary system there, of course, which works a little differently from ours. In some ways, it's easier to make fast change there. Now, it worked in favor of limited governments when Thatcher was in charge. She was able to quickly reverse a lot of very destructive policies, but a lot of those were undone too. And probably the United States is a little more resilient to that because of we've never been that far down the road to socialism as Britain was for so long.